Podcaster Joe Rogan, who is a frequent spreader of COVID misinformation, was fact-checked on his show in real time. Here it is.
I don't think it's true that there's an increased risk of myocarditis from people catching COVID that are young versus increased risk of myocarditis from the vaccine.
No, there is. There's both.
12 to 17 more likely to develop myocarditis with 3 months of catching COVID at a rate of 450 cases per million infection. This compares to 67 cases of myocarditis per million at the same time following their second dose of Pfizer.
Yeah, so you're about 8 times likelier to get myocarditis from getting COVID than from getting the vaccine.
That's interesting.
Now, that
is not what I've read before, but also it's like, even when we're reading these things, it's like, what are we getting this from?
Talk about moving the goalposts. Now, 270 health experts are calling on Spotify to take action, writing in an open letter, quote, by allowing the propagation of false and societally harmful assertions, Spotify is enabling its hosted media to damage public trust in scientific research and sow doubt in the credibility of data-driven guidance offered by medical professionals.
CNN is continuing the campaign against Joe Rogan to try and get him canceled. In their latest attempt, they brought on their show one of the doctors that signed the letter to Spotify, asking Spotify to implement a policy to prevent further misinformation from spreading on what is considered the nation's most popular podcast. Before we get into their most recent attempt, let's review the event so far. Going back to April 2021, Joe said on his podcast that he is not saying vaccines are unsafe, but that if a 21-year-old asked him if he should get vaccinated, he would ask him if he was healthy and wouldn't recommend it to him. For a simple comment like that, CNN felt the need to emphasize that Joe was causing vaccine hesitancy and, quote, was giving air to anti-vax narrative, unquote. What about his comments is anti-vax? Anybody that listens to Joe knows that he's not anti-vax. He's just against the mandate. And then the doctor they had on went on to call his comments very destructive.
He has a pretty big platform, and that's really destructive.
Are they endangering the health of their listeners and the community?
Well, they certainly are making it more difficult to get to the common goal that we all want to get to.
And as you can see in the clip, they asked Mr. Science himself if people like Joe are endangering their listeners. Then a few months ago, Joe got COVID and he went live on Instagram and told everyone he had thrown the kitchen sink at it. And one of the drugs that he mentioned was ivermectin. And what did CNN do? They decided to emphasize the fact that he took ivermectin and started a campaign against Joe Rogan for using a horse dewormer. They repeatedly lied on their network about him using a horse dewormer, as if he wasn't able to afford people medicine. To make matters worse, Dr. Sanjay Gupta went on the show with Joe and admitted that they shouldn't have called it a horse dewormer.
Does it bother you that the news network you work for out and out lied, just outright lied about me taking horse dewormer?
They shouldn't have said that.
Why did they do that?
I don't know.
Immediately after Sanjay appeared on the Joe Rogan podcast and admitted that CNN shouldn't have called it a horse dewormer, CNN couldn't let it stand that their top medical correspondent had sided with Joe. So then Don Lemon himself had Sanjay Gupta back on his show to have him retract the statements and admit that CNN did not do anything wrong, clearly contradicting what he had just said on the Joe Rogan podcast. Next, earlier this week, they ran segments highlighting a letter signed by 270 doctors and scientists that want Spotify to implement a misinformation policy in response to Joe being a menace to public health on his podcast. Finally, in their latest attempt in their campaign against him, they used a segment where Joe is fact-checked by Josh Hezebs on his podcast and completely neglected to give the full story. If CNN was even remotely interested in actual journalism, they would have bothered to look up the article from The Guardian that Joe Rogan posted on his Twitter account that he was referencing during the episode. In the article, it clearly states that healthy boys may be more likely to be admitted to hospital with the rare side effect of the Pfizer COVID vaccine that causes inflammation of the heart than with COVID itself, U.S. researchers claim. And it's not even Joe that is hesitant to recommend vaccination for young boys. The UK's Joint Committee on Vaccine and Immunization did not recommend vaccinating healthy 12 to 15-year-olds, but referred the matter to the UK's chief medical officers, who are expected to make a final decision next week. It's clear to me that CNN has a bone to pick with Joe and they're trying to discredit him. So what should I take away from all of this, in addition to the fact that CNN thinks that Joe Rogan and all his fans are morons and they cannot take the risk of allowing them to listen to him? The best solution would be to allow some of the doctors that signed that letter to go on his show and debate him. And maybe Joe can also have on Dr. Robert Malone and Peter McCullough to defend the other side. But that is highly unlikely to happen. As we already know from CNN, they can't hold our elected officials accountable, but they expect more from a podcaster. And he didn't even deny that he was wrong. He admitted it on the podcast and also on Twitter afterwards, like any rational person would. At the end of the day, CNN is just losing more and more of my trust. And in reality, isn't Joe just having a conversation? That's how you're supposed to learn, through dialogue. The only difference is that Joe is actually willing to be humbled and be proven wrong and admitted. And when CNN knows that something is wrong, they'll just keep repeating the opposite until they think that it'll become true. Unfortunately for CNN though, I think we're all capable of sorting out all of their BS on our own. That's it for today, guys. Don't forget to leave a comment down below with what you think. Thank you.